The news of how Margaret died hit everyone hard. David sat in his office at the Historical Society with the French police report in front of him, reading the details again and again. The accident had happened on a rainy evening. Their rental car had gone off a narrow mountain road and crashed into a ravine. All 3 passengers died on impact. The French authorities ruled it an accident caused by poor weather conditions and an unfamiliar road. But David couldn't stop wondering. Had it really been an accident? Margaret's letter suggested she was afraid, that Charles had been drinking more, getting angrier. There was no way to know what had happened in that car in the moments before the crash. Whether it was truly an accident or something darker would remain a mystery forever. Elena felt the weight of it differently. She kept thinking about Margaret spending her final weeks hiding her music, protecting it, believing that somehow it would survive and be heard. Margaret had died never knowing if her plan worked, never knowing if anyone would find her symphony or understand what it meant. Robert took it hardest of all. For 32 years, he'd carried the guilt of not going back for the manuscript. He'd told himself Margaret was probably fine, living somewhere in Europe, maybe even playing piano again. The truth was so much worse. She'd been dead within weeks of their last conversation, buried in a foreign country with no one to mourn her except the piano teacher she'd met in secret. "I should have done more," Robert kept saying to his daughter. "I should have broken into that mansion. I should have contacted the police when I couldn't reach her. I should have fought for her." Carol tried to comfort him, but she understood that this was a grief he'd been avoiding for 3 decades, and now it had all come crashing down at once. The Millbrook community, which had been following the story with fascination, now felt a collective sadness. The mystery had turned into a tragedy. Margaret Hartwell wasn't a woman who'd escaped to find a better life. She was a victim, trapped until the very end. But David, Elena, and Robert all agreed on one thing. They wouldn't let Margaret's story end with her death. She'd wanted her music heard, and they were going to make that happen no matter what it took. The first step was getting the symphony ready for performance. Elena contacted several orchestra conductors, explaining the situation and asking if they'd be willing to review Margaret's work. Most were intrigued by the story, but cautious about the music itself. There was always a risk with amateur compositions that they'd be technically problematic or musically uninteresting. A conductor named Vincent Torres from the Regional Symphony agreed to look at the manuscript first. He'd heard about the story on the news and was curious. When Elena delivered the carefully photocopied pages to him, he promised to review them within a week. 3 days later, Vincent called back. His voice was excited in a way that immediately told Elena the news was good. "This is remarkable," Vincent said. "I'm not exaggerating. Margaret Hartwell was genuinely talented. The symphony is complex, emotionally powerful, and technically sound. It deserves to be performed by a professional orchestra. I want to do it." They scheduled a meeting to discuss the details. Vincent explained that the symphony would need about 70 musicians and would take months of rehearsal to prepare properly. But he was committed to making it happen. He'd already started talking to his board about doing a special performance. Robert wanted to be involved in every step. Despite his arthritis, he volunteered to help with the preparations. Vincent welcomed him, recognizing that Robert understood Margaret's intentions better than anyone else alive. Together, they went through the manuscript, discussing Margaret's notations, interpreting her instructions, making sure every detail was honored. The cassette tapes Robert had saved became invaluable. They could hear Margaret playing through sections of the symphony, understanding the tempo and emotion she'd intended. Her playing wasn't perfect, technical mistakes here and there, but the feeling was unmistakable. Vincent listened to the tapes over and over, trying to capture that same emotional quality. Meanwhile, David worked on publicity and fundraising. Producing a symphony performance was expensive, and they wanted to do it right. He started a crowdfunding campaign, explaining Margaret's story and asking for support. The response was overwhelming. People from across the country donated, moved by the tragedy and wanting to help give Margaret the voice she'd never had in life. They also established a scholarship fund in Margaret's name. Any proceeds from the performance would go toward supporting young musicians, particularly women who faced obstacles in pursuing their musical dreams. It felt like the right way to honor her legacy, helping others avoid the silence she'd been forced to endure. The town of Millbrook embraced the project completely. The Historical Society organized an exhibition about Margaret's life, displaying the photographs, some of the letters, and telling her story in a way that was respectful but honest. Local schools brought students to learn about her, using her experience to talk about following your dreams and finding your voice. The Steinway piano underwent complete restoration in Elena's workshop. She worked on it carefully over several months, replacing worn parts, restringing where necessary, refinishing the cabinet to restore its original beauty. When she was done, the piano looked magnificent, gleaming black with perfect action and rich tone. The instrument would be featured in the performance, with Robert playing the solo piano sections despite his arthritis. Vincent had suggested bringing in a professional pianist, but Robert refused. "Margaret taught me these parts," he said. "She played them for me over and over. It should be me. She would have wanted it to be me." They practiced for months. Robert's fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, and some passages were genuinely difficult for him. But he worked at it with dedication that impressed everyone. Vincent adjusted the orchestration slightly in a few places, accommodating Robert's limitations while staying true to Margaret's vision. As the performance date approached, media attention intensified. News outlets across the country picked up the story. National television programs sent reporters to interview David, Elena, and Robert. Margaret Hartwell's tragedy and triumph became known far beyond Millbrook. The performance was scheduled for a warm evening in June 2026, 8 months after Miguel first found the piano in the abandoned mansion. They'd chosen the Millbrook Town Hall, a beautiful old building with excellent acoustics that had hosted concerts for over a century. Tickets sold out within hours, with a waiting list of hundreds hoping for cancellations. The evening of the performance, the town hall was filled to capacity. Over 500 people crowded into every available seat, with more standing at the back. The audience was mixed. Local residents who'd followed the story from the beginning, classical music lovers who'd traveled from nearby cities, and journalists covering the event. The restored Steinway sat on stage, spotlit and gleaming. Behind it, 70 musicians from the regional symphony were assembled, their instruments tuned and ready. Vincent stood at the conductor's podium, dressed in formal concert attire. The house lights dimmed and the audience fell silent. Vincent turned to face them before beginning. "Tonight," he said, "we perform a symphony that was hidden for 32 years. Its composer, Margaret Hartwell, died never knowing if anyone would hear her work. She spent most of her life silent, her talent suppressed, her voice unheard. But tonight we fulfill her final wish. Tonight Margaret speaks." He turned back to the orchestra, raised his baton, and the music began. The first movement opened with strings, a melancholy melody that immediately captured attention. It was beautiful but tinged with sadness, like looking back on lost dreams. The orchestration was sophisticated, with instruments weaving in and out, creating layers of emotion. Robert's hands found the piano keys when his part came. Despite his arthritis, despite the years, despite everything, he played Margaret's music. The notes weren't always perfect, a few fumbles here and there, but the emotion was absolutely genuine. You could hear in his playing the weight of regret, of memory, of a promise finally kept. The second movement was more turbulent, with dramatic swells and sudden quiet moments. You could hear Margaret's frustration in it, her anger at being trapped, her desperation to break free. The orchestra played with intensity that made the audience lean forward in their seats. The third movement was the shortest, a sort of interlude that felt like a brief moment of joy. It was lighter, almost playful, perhaps representing those secret lessons, those hours when Margaret could be herself. Robert played a delicate piano solo in this section, his arthritic fingers managing a melody that sounded like laughter, like stolen happiness. Then came the fourth movement, the one Margaret had titled Liberation in her manuscript. It started quietly, tentatively, building slowly. The piano and orchestra engaged in a kind of conversation, trading phrases, building on each other's ideas. The music grew more confident, more powerful, swelling toward what should have been a triumphant conclusion. But then, something unexpected. Instead of ending on a major chord, on a note of victory, Margaret had written something different. The music didn't resolve cleanly. It ended on an open question, a chord progression that felt unfinished, hanging in the air. Vincent held the final note, the orchestra sustaining it, letting it fill the hall. Then slowly he brought his hands down and the music stopped. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then the audience erupted. People stood applauding, many with tears streaming down their faces. The ovation went on for minutes, the crowd refusing to stop. As if by clapping they could somehow reach back through time and tell Margaret that her voice had been heard. Robert sat at the piano with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Carol came from the wings to put her arms around him. David and Elena stood together in the audience, both crying openly. Miguel, who'd brought his whole family to the concert, wiped his eyes and thought about the random chance that had led him to pull that tarp off an old piano 8 months ago. Vincent turned to the audience once more. "The ending you just heard," he explained, "is exactly as Margaret wrote it. She deliberately left the symphony unfinished, unresolved. We think we understand why. Margaret's own story didn't have a happy ending. She never got the liberation she was writing about. The music reflects that truth. It's honest in its incompleteness." The audience applauded again, understanding. After the concert, people lined up to thank Robert, to share how moved they'd been, to tell their own stories of dreams deferred or voices silenced. An elderly woman told him she'd given up painting when she got married, and had just bought new art supplies that afternoon. A young man said he'd been too afraid to audition for music school, but was going to apply now. A middle-aged man admitted he'd been working a job he hated for 20 years and was finally going to quit and pursue what he actually loved. Margaret's story was giving other people permission to find their own voices. The recording of the performance was released online, and within weeks it had been streamed millions of times. Classical music critics praised Margaret's work, with several noting that she'd been genuinely talented and would likely have had a successful career if she'd been given the chance. The recording's proceeds went to the scholarship fund, which grew large enough to support multiple students each year. The Steinway piano remained in Millbrook Town Hall as a permanent installation. A plaque next to it told Margaret's story in brief, ending with her own words, "Let my music live even if I cannot." The old Hartwell mansion was eventually demolished, as planned, but not before the Historical Society salvaged several items for their exhibition. The ballroom where Margaret had secretly practiced was photographed extensively, preserving its memory. Robert lived 2 more years after the performance, long enough to see the scholarship fund award its first recipients, and to witness Margaret's symphony performed 3 more times by different orchestras. He died peacefully in his sleep in 2028, and Carol made sure his obituary mentioned his role in preserving Margaret's legacy. The story of the forgotten grand piano became one of those local legends that gets told and retold, growing and changing slightly with each telling but always keeping its essential truth. That one woman refused to let her voice be completely silenced, that she found a way to speak even from beyond death, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we almost throw away. In towns and cities across the country, people who heard Margaret's story started looking at the silenced voices around them differently. They started asking older women about dreams they'd given up, talents they'd suppressed, voices they'd learned to quiet. And some of those voices, after decades of silence, started speaking again. Margaret Hartwell never got to live the life she wanted. She never got to hear her symphony performed by a professional orchestra. She never got the recognition she deserved or the freedom she craved. But in the end, her music did exactly what she hoped it would. It lived, it mattered, it changed things. And that forgotten grand piano hidden in an abandoned mansion had revealed not just one woman's story, but a truth that resonated across generations. That every silenced voice matters, that it's never too late for truth to surface, and that the things we create in hope can outlive even the most tragic circumstances. Margaret's symphony plays on, unfinished and honest, a reminder that liberation doesn't always come the way we hope, but our voices can echo far beyond our own lifetimes if we're brave enough to hide them, where someone will eventually look. Getting the piano moved safely was going to be a challenge. The Steinway had been sitting in that ballroom for over 30 years, and while it looked intact, nobody knew what condition it was really in. Elena made calls to piano restoration experts across the state, explaining the situation and asking for advice. The decision was made to transport the piano to Elena's restoration workshop. It was equipped with the right climate control, proper lighting, and all the tools they'd need to work on it carefully. More importantly, it was secure. The story had gotten so much attention that they worried about vandals or treasure hunters trying to break into the mansion. a specialized piano moving company arrived 3 days later with equipment designed for instruments this valuable. The crew spent an hour just examining the Steinway before they'd even consider moving it. They checked the frame, tested the legs, assessed the weight distribution. The piano was heavy, over 1,000 pounds, and one wrong move could damage it beyond repair. Robert insisted on being there, despite his daughter's concerns about his health. Carol drove him over, and he stood watching with his cane, occasionally calling out reminders to the movers about being gentle with certain parts. It was clear that this piano meant everything to him, that it represented not just Margaret's legacy but his own regrets and memories. Miguel was there too, feeling oddly connected to this whole story. He was the one who'd found the piano after all. As the movers carefully tilted the Steinway onto their special dolly, Miguel thought about how close they'd come to demolishing the mansion with the piano still inside, with Margaret's symphony still hidden in its secret compartment. The transportation took most of the afternoon. They moved slowly, taking a route that avoided rough roads and sharp turns. Behind the moving truck, Elena drove with David and Robert, and Carol followed in her own car. It felt like a funeral procession, solemn and important. Elena's workshop was in a converted warehouse outside of town. The space was filled with pianos in various states of restoration, from barely holding together uprights to concert grands that just needed tuning. But they cleared the main work area for the Steinway, positioning it under the best lights with room to work around it from all sides. Once the piano was settled and the movers had left, the small group stood around it in silence. The moment felt heavy with possibility and dread. What if the manuscript wasn't there? What if it had been damaged by moisture or insects over the decades? What if Robert's memory of the note sequence was wrong after all these years? Should we clean it first? David asked Elena. She shook her head. Not until we've opened the compartment. We don't want to risk disturbing anything. Once we have the manuscript secured, then we can start the restoration process. Robert moved closer to the piano, reaching out to touch the keys. His fingers were gnarled with arthritis, the joints swollen and stiff. I don't know if I can play it anymore, he admitted quietly. My hands aren't what they used to be. Just try, Elena encouraged. Even if the notes aren't perfect, maybe the mechanism will respond to the general sequence. Robert sat down slowly on the piano bench that the movers had positioned. He tested a few keys and muted discordant sounds came out. The piano hadn't been tuned in 30 years, and while the strings were intact, they were badly out of tune. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was the sequence, the pattern of notes that Margaret had created specifically to unlock her secret. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His fingers found their positions on the keys. Then he began to play. The melody was haunting even on the out-of-tune piano. It started in a minor key, sad and searching, then shifted unexpectedly to something that felt almost hopeful before returning to melancholy. It was only about 30 seconds long, but it felt significant, purposeful. This wasn't just a random sequence of notes. This was music with meaning. As Robert played the final note, they all heard it. A soft click, mechanical and definite, coming from somewhere inside the piano's body. Robert's hands were shaking as he lifted them from the keys. Elena moved quickly, pulling on a pair of cotton gloves. She carefully examined the area beneath the keyboard, running her hands along the wood. There she found it, a small panel that had shifted slightly, revealing a gap that hadn't been there before. The panel was designed to blend seamlessly with the piano's interior, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I need better light, Elena said, her voice tight with tension. David brought over a high-powered flashlight while Carol steadied her father, who'd stood up from the bench and was watching with his hand pressed against his chest. Elena worked the panel gently, easing it open. Behind it was a space about 2 feet wide and a foot deep, lined with what looked like velvet fabric to protect whatever was stored inside. And there, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound manuscript. Oh my God, David whispered. It's real. It's actually there. Elena lifted the wrapped manuscript out as carefully as if she were defusing a bomb. She carried it to a clean work table and slowly unwrapped the oilcloth. Beneath it, the leather binding looked remarkably well preserved. The compartment had protected it from humidity and temperature changes. Margaret had chosen her hiding place well. Robert was crying again, openly this time. Carol had her arm around him, tears on her own face. Miguel found himself getting emotional too. Though he'd never met any of these people when they were alive, there was something overwhelming about holding history in your hands like this, about seeing someone's dream pulled out of hiding after 3 decades. Elena opened the manuscript carefully. The first page was a title page written in Margaret's elegant handwriting. Symphony in E minor, A Life Unplayed. Composed by Margaret Ann Hartwell, 1991-1994. Below the title was a dedication to R, who helped me find my voice. And to everyone who has lived in silence. The manuscript was complete. 4 movements, fully orchestrated with detailed notations about tempo, dynamics, and expression. Margaret had been meticulous in her work. Each page was filled with musical notation, careful and precise. In the margins, she'd written notes to herself, reminders, thoughts about what each section should convey. But there was more in the compartment. Elena reached in again and pulled out another document, this one just a few pages. It was a letter, sealed in a plastic bag to protect it. The bag wasn't original. It looked newer, like something Margaret had done in those final weeks before she left. To whoever finds this, the envelope read. David carefully removed the letter from its protective bag and began reading aloud. Everyone in the room fell silent. If you're reading this, it means someone found my symphony. I don't know how long it's been or who you are, but thank you for looking. Thank you for caring enough to search. My name is Margaret Ann Hartwell, and I am 59 years old. I'm writing this in October of 1994, just a few days before my family leaves for Europe. I don't think I'm coming back. I don't know exactly how to explain this without sounding melodramatic, but I need you to understand why this music matters so much. I was supposed to be a pianist. When I was young, that's all I wanted. I won competitions, performed in concerts, got accepted to a prestigious conservatory. But then I met Charles Hartwell and my parents saw an opportunity. The Hartwells were old money, respected, powerful. What was music compared to that kind of security? So I married Charles when I was 23 years old. I gave up the conservatory, gave up performing, gave up composing. I became Mrs. Hartwell. And Mrs. Hartwell didn't play piano except at parties. Didn't have dreams beyond hosting successful dinner parties and raising a respectable son. For 30 years I lived that life. I pretended to be happy. I pretended it was enough. But it wasn't. It was never enough. When I was 53, I decided I couldn't live that way anymore. I found R, a teacher who understood what music meant to me. We worked together in secret, and slowly, I remembered who I used to be. Or maybe I discovered who I'd always been underneath. This symphony is everything I couldn't say out loud. Every argument I swallowed. Every dream I pushed down. Every moment I felt invisible in my own life. It's all here in these notes and these melodies. This is my voice, the only true thing I've ever created. Charles found out about my lessons, about my composing. He was furious. He said I was embarrassing him, wasting time on childish dreams. He threatened to destroy everything I'd written, to sell the piano, to make sure I never touched an instrument again, and I realized that I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let my voice be silenced again. Not now that I'd finally found it, so I made a choice. I convinced Charles and William to take this trip to Europe. I told them it would be good for us, time to reconnect as a family. But really, I needed to get them away from here, away from my music. I've hidden everything that matters. The manuscript is safe. R knows how to find it if I can't come back for it myself. I don't know what will happen in Europe. Maybe we'll have such a wonderful time that Charles will soften, that I'll find the courage to demand the life I want. Maybe I'll find a way to leave him there, to start over somewhere new. Or maybe this trip will end badly. Charles has been so angry lately, and when he drinks, he gets mean. Our son William is just like him. I feel outnumbered and alone, but even if the worst happens, my symphony will survive. That's what matters. I need my music to live even if I don't. I need someone to hear it, to perform it, to let it matter. Please don't let my silence be permanent. Please give my voice a chance to be heard. The letter was signed and dated October 15th, 1994. David's hands were shaking as he lowered the paper. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The implications of Margaret's words hung heavy in the air. Robert broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. She knew something bad might happen. She was trying to protect herself and the music, but she knew. Elena was already pulling out her phone. We need to find out what happened to them. The Hartwells left in late October 1994 and disappeared. The mansion was locked up, but nobody ever filed a missing persons report because everyone assumed they'd just moved. But this letter, it sounds like Margaret was afraid. David nodded. I'll contact the police, see if there are any records. If they went to Europe, there should be passport records, travel documentation, something. Miguel spoke up. What about the symphony? Are we going to be able to play it? Elena looked at the manuscript, at Margaret's careful notations, at the life's work sitting on the table in front of them. We need to honor her wishes. She wanted it performed. But first we need to know what happened to her. We owe her that much. Over the next few days, David worked with local police and international agencies, trying to trace the Hartwell family's movements in 1994. It was slow work, going through old records, making calls across the ocean, piecing together a trail that had gone cold 32 years ago. And then they found it. A police report from a small town in rural France dated November 3, 1994. A car accident on a narrow mountain road. 3 victims. Charles Hartwell, age 61. William Hartwell, age 35. Margaret Ann Hartwell, age 59. The French police had tried to contact next of kin at the time, but the Hartwells had no close relatives. The estate was tied up in probate. Lawyers couldn't be reached, and eventually the case was closed. The bodies had been buried in France in an unmarked section of a local cemetery, their story forgotten. Margaret had never made it home. She'd never gotten to hear her symphony performed. She'd died still trapped in the life she was trying to escape, her voice still silenced. The story of Margaret Hartwell's hidden letters spread through Millbrook faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, it wasn't just local news anymore. Regional television stations were covering it, and social media had picked it up in a big way. People were sharing the story, speculating about what had happened, and most importantly, they were remembering. At Bernie's Diner on Main Street, the breakfast crowd talked about nothing else. The diner had been a Millbrook fixture for 50 years, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and gossip flowed as freely as the coffee. Patricia Winters sat in her usual booth by the window, nursing her second cup of decaf and listening to the conversation swirling around her. Patricia was 73 now, a retired school teacher who'd lived in Millbrook her entire life. She'd taught 3rd grade for 40 years, watched generations of kids grow up, and remembered things that most people had forgotten. When she heard people talking about Margaret Hartwell, something stirred in her memory. I knew her, Patricia said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that the conversations around her quieted down. Margaret Hartwell. I remember her. The diner owner, Bernie himself, came over to her booth. What do you remember, Pat? Patricia stared out the window, watching the morning traffic. This would have been in the early 90s, maybe 92 or 93. The school had a spring fundraiser every year, always at someone's fancy house. One year it was at the Hartwell mansion. Margaret was there, of course, playing hostess. But I remember she seemed so sad. She paused, collecting her thoughts. Everyone else was mingling, drinking wine, laughing. But Margaret, she kept drifting away from the party. I found her once standing in the hallway, just staring at a closed door. When she noticed me, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said something strange. She said, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Other people in the diner started sharing their own memories. Tom Fletcher, who ran the hardware store, remembered delivering piano parts to the Hartwell mansion one time. Must have been 1990 or 91, he said. The order came through my shop. Special delivery had to be precise parts for a Steinway. Charles Hartwell met me at the door, took the parts, paid in cash. He seemed angry about something, told me not to mention the delivery to anyone. I thought it was odd, but the Hartwells were odd people. Linda Morrison, who'd worked at the post office for decades, chimed in. Margaret used to come in regularly to mail letters. Always bought the nice stamps, the ones with artwork on them. She'd address them herself right there at the counter. Never saw who they were going to. But she was always very particular about making sure they had enough postage. The memories kept coming. Puzzle pieces that hadn't made sense individually but were now forming a picture. Margaret Hartwell, the quiet woman in the big house, had been hiding an entire world that nobody knew about. She'd been living 2 lives, and somehow she'd managed to keep them separate for years. David Chen from the Historical Society appeared on the local morning news. He'd brought some of the photographs, carefully selected to respect Margaret's privacy while telling her story. The interviewer asked him what he hoped to accomplish by sharing this. Margaret Hartwell wanted her music to be heard, David said. That's clear from everything we've found. We're hoping to locate her piano teacher, the man she called R in her letters. He's a crucial part of this story, and he might know where to find the symphony she composed. The segment ended with a request. Anyone with information about Margaret Hartwell or her piano? Teacher should contact the Millbrook Historical Society. 2 hours later, David's phone rang. It was a woman named Carol Kempler, calling from Riverside Care Center in the next town. She'd seen the morning news and she needed to talk to him right away. Her father, Robert Kempler, was the man in the photographs. David dropped everything and drove to the retirement home immediately, calling Elena to meet him there. The Riverside Care Center was a pleasant enough place with gardens and common areas where residents could socialize. Carol met them in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with worry written across her face. My dad saw the news last night, she explained as she led them to his room. He didn't sleep. He's been sitting up just staring at that photograph, crying. I haven't seen him like this in years. He wants to tell you everything, but I need you to understand this is hard for him. These are memories he's kept private for a very long time. Robert Kempler's room was bright with afternoon sun. He sat in an armchair by the window, and when David and Elena entered, he stood up slowly, steadying himself with a cane. At 68, he looked older than his years, but his eyes were sharp and clear. That's me, he said, pointing to the photograph David had brought. That's Margaret and me, spring of 1992. One of the best days of my life, and one I've regretted ever since. They sat down, and Robert began to talk. His story poured out like he'd been holding it in for too long, waiting for someone who would understand. He'd been a piano teacher working in the city, he explained, taking private clients to supplement his income from the music school where he taught. In 1989, a friend of a friend contacted him about a potential student. The client wanted absolute discretion, lessons given at unusual times, and was willing to pay double his normal rate. That client was Margaret Hartwell. The first time I met her, I almost said no, Robert admitted. All the secrecy felt wrong, you know? But then she sat down at that piano and played. Her technique was rusty. She hadn't played seriously in years, but the emotion was there, the passion. You can't teach that. You either have it or you don't, and Margaret had it. For 2 years, Robert drove to Millbrook twice a week for Margaret's lessons. They'd work in the ballroom where the grand piano sat, always during the day when her husband was at work. Margaret would wait by the window, watching for his car, and unlock the side door so he could enter without being seen from the street. We worked on everything, Robert said. Classical pieces, modern compositions, technique, theory. But what Margaret really wanted was to compose. She had melodies in her head that she'd been carrying for years. Harmony progressions she'd thought about while doing dishes or hosting dinner parties. She wanted to get them out, to make them real. He described watching Margaret transform during their lessons. The quiet, almost timid woman who greeted him at the door would become someone else entirely when she played. Her whole body changed, her face lit up, her hands moved with certainty and grace. She was, he said, genuinely talented. In 1991, she told me she wanted to write a symphony, Robert continued. I tried to explain how difficult that was, how much work it would take. But she was determined. We started working on it together. She'd write sections and bring them to lessons, and we'd refine them, work out the orchestration, solve the technical problems. He pulled out a box from beneath his bed and opened it. Inside were cassette tapes, dozens of them, all labeled in neat handwriting. I recorded every session, he said. Margaret wanted a record of her work in progress. She was so afraid something would happen to the manuscript that she'd lose everything she'd created. Elena carefully picked up one of the tapes. The label read, Margaret, Symphony in E minor, First Movement, Take 7, April 1992. Robert also had photographs, more than what they'd found in the piano. Pictures of Margaret at the keyboard, absorbed in her work. Pictures of the two of them collaborating over sheet music. Pictures of her laughing at a mistake or concentrated in thought, or triumphant when she'd solved a difficult passage. We weren't having an affair, Robert said firmly, anticipating the question. I want that to be clear. I was happily married, had 2 kids at home. Margaret and I were friends, colleagues. But we understood each other in a way that was rare. She saw me as more than just a teacher, and I saw her as the artist she truly was. The trouble started in late 1993, Robert explained. Charles Hartwell found out about the lessons. How he discovered them, Robert never knew for sure. Maybe a neighbor mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car, or maybe he found a receipt. Either way, Charles confronted Margaret and forbade her from continuing. Margaret called me crying, Robert said. She asked if we could meet one more time. So I drove out there, and we met at a coffee shop in the next town where no one would recognize us. She told me everything. How Charles called her music a waste of time, how he'd threatened to get rid of the piano if she didn't stop. But Margaret hadn't stopped. She'd simply become more careful. For the next several months they met less frequently, always at different locations. A church with an old piano where Robert had connections. A music school in the city, anywhere but the Hartwell mansion. She finished the symphony in the summer of 1994, Robert said, his voice dropping. 4 complete movements. It was beautiful, truly beautiful. Complex but emotional, technically impressive but accessible. It deserved to be performed by a real orchestra, heard by real audiences. He picked up one of the cassettes and held it gently, as if it were made of glass. This is the recording of her playing through the whole thing for the first time, start to finish. She cried when it was done, said it was the only thing in her life that was truly hers. Then Robert's expression darkened. In October 1994, Margaret called me. She was panicked. Charles had found out she'd continued the lessons. He'd found some of her composition work, I think. She said he was threatening to destroy everything. She was terrified, not for herself, but for the music. Margaret told Robert about her plan. She'd hidden the complete manuscript inside the piano, in a special compartment she'd discovered years ago. She'd given Robert a specific sequence of notes to play, a melody she'd written that would release the hidden panel. She made him promise that if anything happened to her, he'd come back and retrieve the symphony. But I never did, Robert said, and now tears were running down his face. She and her family left town shortly after that. Everyone said they'd moved to Europe. I tried calling, but the number was disconnected. I drove by the mansion once, but it was all locked up. I convinced myself that maybe she was okay. Maybe she'd found a way to take her music with her. He looked at David and Elena with red-rimmed eyes. I should have broken in. I should have gotten that manuscript right away. But I was afraid. I had my own family to protect, my own career. I told myself I'd wait until things settled down, but they never did. The mansion stayed locked up, and eventually I stopped thinking about it every day. But I never forgot. God help me, I never forgot. Carol, who'd been standing quietly by the door, came over and put her hand on her father's shoulder. Dad, you couldn't have known. I should have tried harder, Robert insisted. Margaret trusted me with the most important thing in her life, and I failed her. David leaned forward. Robert, it's not too late. We can still fulfill Margaret's wish. But we need your help. You said she taught you a sequence of notes to open the hidden compartment in the piano. Do you remember it? Robert closed his eyes and his fingers moved slightly as if playing invisible keys. I played that melody 1,000 times in my head over the years, afraid I'd forget it. Yes, I remember. Elena suggested they take the portfolio somewhere safe before examining it properly. The leather was old and fragile, and the papers inside deserved careful handling. Miguel agreed immediately. He'd seen enough to know this wasn't just about an old piano anymore. This was history, possibly something important. They decided to bring everything to the Millbrook Historical Society. The building was just a 10-minute drive from the mansion, housed in a renovated brick schoolhouse from the 1800s. David Chen had been the curator there for almost 15 years. He was the kind of person who got genuinely excited about old photographs and forgotten documents, which made him perfect for the job. When Elena called ahead and explained what they'd found, David told them to come right over. By the time they arrived, he'd already cleared space on one of the large research tables and set out cotton gloves, acid-free folders, and a camera for documentation. His enthusiasm was infectious. I can't believe something like this was just sitting there all these years, David said as Elena carefully placed the portfolio on the table. The Hartwell disappearance has always been one of those local mysteries everyone talks about, but nobody really knows the truth. They decided to work methodically. David photographed each item before they handled it, creating a digital record. Then, wearing the cotton gloves, they began removing the contents piece by piece. The first thing they pulled out was a stack of letters, maybe 40 or 50 of them, all tied together with string. The letters were written on expensive stationery, the kind with a subtle watermark. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, the type that takes years of practice to develop. Each letter was dated starting from September 1989 and continuing through October 1994. They were all signed by Margaret Hartwell, and they were all addressed to someone identified only as R. Elena began reading the first letter aloud. Margaret's voice, frozen in ink for over 30 years, came alive again. She wrote about feeling trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, about dreams she'd abandoned, about music that called to her in the quiet moments when no one was watching. The letter mentioned that she'd begun taking piano lessons again in secret, working with a teacher who understood what music meant to her. The second letter was more hopeful. Margaret wrote about rediscovering pieces she'd loved as a young woman, about her fingers remembering movements she thought she'd forgotten. She mentioned how playing made her feel alive in a way nothing else did, but there was also fear in her words, worry about what would happen if her husband found out. David and Elena continued reading through the collection. The letters painted a picture of a woman living two lives. On the surface, she was Mrs. Charles Hartwell, wife of a prominent businessman, hostess of society events, keeper of the family image. But underneath, she was Margaret the musician, someone with passion and talent that had been buried for decades. The letters to R were clearly to her piano teacher. She wrote about their lessons, about techniques he'd shown her, about the music they'd discussed. But there was something more than just a student-teacher relationship in these words. Not romantic exactly, but deeply personal. He was perhaps the only person who saw the real Margaret, who understood what she'd sacrificed. Around the 20th letter, dated in early 1992, the tone shifted. Margaret mentioned a new project she'd started, something she'd been thinking about for years but had never dared to attempt. She was composing music, not just playing anymore, but creating. She wrote with excitement and terror in equal measure, as if she couldn't quite believe she was doing. This, the next several letters documented, her progress on what she called her secret work. She'd write about melodies that came to her while pretending to read in the library, about harmonies she'd work out late at night when everyone was asleep. She wrote about the frustration when she couldn't get a passage right, and the joy when something finally clicked into place. Mixed in with the letters were photographs. The first one showed Margaret as a young woman, probably in her early 20s, sitting at a piano with a bright smile. She looked different from the formal portrait photos that had hung in the mansion's hallway. In these pictures, she looked genuinely happy. Later photos showed her older, the years visible in her face, but that same light still in her eyes when she was near the piano. And then there were photos of Margaret with a man in his 40s, both of them sitting at a piano bench, his hands guiding hers on the keys. The man's face was kind, patient. In several photos, they were both laughing at something. David turned over one of these photos and found handwriting on the back. With R, the only one who truly understood. Spring 1992. The date matched the letters from that same period when Margaret had been at her most hopeful, writing about the symphony she was creating. They found more treasures in the portfolio. Sheet music with Margaret's handwritten annotations. A concert program from 1968 where a young Margaret Hartwell had performed Chopin. A newspaper clipping about her winning a state-level piano competition as a teenager. All the evidence of a musical talent that had been real and significant, not just a hobby. Elena picked up another letter, this one from late 1993. Margaret's handwriting looked more rushed, less controlled. She wrote about pressure from her husband Charles to stop the lessons, to stop wasting time on music. He'd found out somehow, maybe from a friend who'd seen her teacher's car parked nearby, or perhaps from a credit card statement showing lesson payments. The letter described an argument where Charles had called her music frivolous and beneath their station. He'd reminded her of who she was, of her responsibilities, of what people expected from the Hartwell family. Margaret wrote about feeling like she was disappearing, becoming invisible even to herself. But then the tone changed again. Margaret wrote that she wouldn't give up this time. She'd given up her music once before when she married Charles, abandoned her dreams of becoming a concert pianist because it wasn't what proper society wives did. She'd spent 30 years being who everyone else wanted her to be. Not anymore. The letters from 1994 showed a woman determined to finish what she'd started. She wrote about hiding her work, about the special compartment in the piano where she kept the manuscript of her symphony. She described teaching her teacher R a specific sequence of notes that would release the hidden panel, a melody she'd written herself. Only he would know how to access it if anything happened to her. David picked up one letter from August 1994 and read it silently, his expression growing troubled. When he finished, he handed it to Elena without a word. Margaret had written about Charles discovering the full extent of her compositions. There'd been another fight, worse this time. He'd threatened to destroy everything she'd worked on, all her music, all her efforts over the years. Margaret wrote that she felt cornered, desperate. She couldn't let her work be destroyed, but she also couldn't see a way forward. The letter ended with a chilling line. "I'm starting to think the only way to protect what I've created is to make sure I'm not around to stop them from finding." The final letter was dated October 15th, 1994. Elena's hands shook slightly as she read it aloud. Margaret wrote that she'd made her decision. She'd convinced Charles and their son William to take a trip to Europe, telling them it would be good for the family, a chance to reconnect. But her real plan was different. She'd made arrangements, hidden her symphony where it would be safe, left clues for R to find it someday. The letter's last paragraph was heartbreaking. Margaret wrote, "By the time anyone reads this, I'll be gone. I don't know what will happen or how this story ends, but I need my music to survive even if I don't. I've spent my whole life being silent, playing my part, being what everyone wanted. My symphony is my voice, the only true thing I've created. Let it live. Let someone hear it. Let it matter." The three of them sat in silence for a long moment after Elena finished reading. The afternoon sun was slanting through the Historical Society's windows, casting long shadows across the table covered with Margaret's letters and photographs. "We need to find out what happened to them," David finally said. "The Hartwells left in late 1994, and no one ever heard from them again. Everyone assumed they just moved away, started over somewhere else." Elena was staring at the photograph of Margaret with her teacher. "And we need to find this man, R. He's the only one who might know the whole story. He's the only one Margaret trusted with the truth." Miguel, who'd been mostly quiet during all the reading, spoke up. "The post I made about the piano, it's gotten huge. Over 1,000 comments now. If this guy is still alive and still in the area, someone might know him. Or he might see it himself." They decided to make a public announcement. David would post on the Historical Society's official page, sharing some of the story and asking for help identifying R, Margaret's piano teacher from the early 1990s. They'd include one of the photos, the one that showed his face most clearly. Within an hour of posting, the story had spread across Millbrook like wildfire. Local news stations picked it up. The neighboring town's newspapers started calling for interviews. Everyone wanted to know more about the mystery of Margaret Hartwell and her hidden music. And somewhere, in a retirement home 2 towns away, an elderly man named Robert Kempler was watching the evening news when he saw his own face staring back at him from a photograph taken more than 30 years ago. The old Hartwell mansion had been sitting empty on Maple Street for more than 30 years. Everyone in town knew about it. Kids would dare each other to peek through the boarded-up windows. Parents would drive past and shake their heads, remembering when the place used to be beautiful. But now, in March of 2026, the mansion's time had finally run out. A demolition crew was scheduled to tear it down and make way for new apartment buildings.